Sometimes all it takes is one conversation to turn a simmering debate into a full-blown national crisis. In Australia, that's exactly what's happening, and it's exposing some really deep divisions over energy, security, and politics. So what is going on? Let's break it down. You might have heard this phrase before, drill, baby, drill. For a long time, it was kind of a fringe political slogan. But now, it's actually echoing a sentiment that's just been captured in a pretty surprising new poll. And it's a huge sign that public opinion on a really core national issue might be shifting in a big way. And this is the number right at the heart of it all, 7 in 10. That's how many Australian voters, and that includes a lot of government supporters, are now saying they want to see more domestic oil production. What's so fascinating here is the trade-off that voters seem willing to make. The poll shows they're prioritizing fuel security, even if that comes at the cost of missing emissions targets. And this one data point, it's become the spark for this massive national debate. Okay, so first up, let's really unpack what this shift in public opinion actually means and why it's sending these immediate political shockwaves through the country. Now, the panel that analyzed this poll, they don't see this as some minor blip. They actually described it as Australians finally waking up to how serious energy security is. From their point of view, it's a direct rejection of the government's net zero emissions policy, with one panelist even calling that goal a ridiculous target. But why this sudden worry? I mean, where is this coming from? Well, according to these commentators, it's because this change in public feeling is directly tied to a much bigger issue, what they're calling a brewing national security crisis. And here is the absolute core of the panel's argument. Take a look at this. They point out that Australia has roughly a month's worth of fuel reserves. Meanwhile, other nations are way more prepared. New Zealand's got 90 days, Japan has 200, and China has a full year's supply. I mean, it is a really stark comparison. So how did we get here? The panel argues this vulnerability comes from a few key failures. First, there's the huge irony of being an incredibly resource-rich nation that somehow still relies on imports. Second, they say that decades of policy have left the country with basically no infrastructure to get to its own oil. And third, they claim the current government just has no plan to fix it. This is a pretty powerful accusation that came up during the discussion. One panelist drew a very direct line, saying that while the COVID crisis was an act of nature, this looming fuel crisis, well, that's an act of government, a direct result of policy decisions. And the way they talk about it, this is incredibly urgent. One commentator went so far as to predict that the government would have to bring in fuel restrictions maybe as soon as the middle of April. So they're not framing this as some distant problem. It's right here, right now. So with that kind of urgency in the air, you can bet the government's leadership is coming under some pretty intense fire. What are the specific criticisms being thrown around by the panel? This figure was brought up as a key example of what the panel sees as a major disconnect. Over $200,000 of taxpayer money spent by the climate change and energy minister. So the big question is, on what? It turns out that money was spent on a VIP jet for a failed campaign to host the COP31 climate conference. The panel absolutely slammed this, calling it deeply hypocritical, using a private jet while pushing for lower emissions, and just completely out of touch with the fuel crisis brewing back home. And it didn't just stop there. The panel also noted that during that same time period, the Prime Minister had spent $1.3 million on private jet travel, which just compounded their whole argument about government priorities. Now, this growing frustration, it's not just a headache for the party in power. It's actually causing these massive tremors across the entire political landscape, and especially for the opposition. One panelist used this really powerful metaphor to explain the coalition's problems. They said the party has been operating under a Disneyland model, just assuming their conservative base has nowhere else to go and will always come back. While the latest polling suggests that assumption is being absolutely shattered. And I mean, just look at how stark these numbers are. According to the RedBridge poll the panel was discussing, Labor is sitting at 32%. But look at this. One Nation has surged to 29%. Meanwhile, the coalition has slumped to a record low of just 17%. To really put that into perspective, the panel was just alarmed that the coalition is now polling only 4 points ahead of the Greens. One commentator even recalled past campaigns where they were 40 points ahead. It just highlights the sheer scale of their collapse, and he warned they might not have even hit rock bottom yet. So this data obviously raises a huge strategic question, which the panel got into a big debate about. With the coalition's vote in freefall and one nation surging, should the conservatives think about some kind of alliance?
But, as the panel discussed, it's a really complex dilemma. On one hand, you've got this idea of a preference deal, where they'd encourage their voters to rank the other party second. It could work to consolidate the conservative vote. But the risk? One nation voters are famously independent. The panel worries a deal could totally backfire, split the vote, and accidentally hand victories to Labour.
And all of this leaves us with one final big question. Is Australia facing a straightforward crisis of energy security? Or is what we're really seeing a deeper crisis of politics, where a fundamental disconnect with voters is reshaping the entire political map? The answer to that is probably going to define the country's direction for years to come.